Imagine, for a second, the most advanced, fearsome military hardware on the planet. I mean, we're talking B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, just slipping completely undetected through radar nets.
Right.
Billions of dollars of precision-guided munitions just raining down from the stratosphere. And in, any traditional conflict, this level of overwhelming air superiority, it just shatters the enemy's command structures in a matter of days.
Oh, absolutely. It's designed to be completely paralyzing.
But what happens when the dust settles, the smoke clears, and you look down and realize the enemy's military clock hasn't even skipped a single beat?
Yeah.
What happens when you drop the ultimate hammer and the anvil it simply swallows it whole?
Well, it forces this total recalibration of what military power actually means, because when your kinetic energy is just absorbed by, hundreds of meters of solid granite, you're not really fighting a conventional war anymore.
You're fighting a mountain.
Exactly. You are fighting geography. And historically speaking, geography remains undefeated.
It really does. And that terrifying, honestly kind of disorienting reality is exactly where we are starting today. So welcome to the deep dive. We are incredibly thrilled to have you at the table with us today.
Absolutely. Glad you're joining us.
So our mission today is to explore this highly detailed, deeply speculative geopolitical analysis. It's drawn from a series of, frankly, fascinating blog posts written back in early 2026 by Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
Right, and it's a very specific scenario he outlines.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical grinding conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. He actually dubs it Operation Epic Fury. But more importantly, we're going to examine the radical, almost unthinkable diplomatic framework he proposes to actually end this thing.
Right. And before we really dig into the mechanics of this, and the mechanics are wild, we do need to establish a few parameters for our discussion here.
Yeah, just some quick housekeeping.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because this source material, it deals with highly charged, very real, ongoing global conflicts involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran. So we want to be absolutely clear with you, the listener. We are not taking sides here.
Nope. Not at all.
We're not endorsing any political viewpoints. We aren't validating the specific outcomes or, the ethical implications of the author's proposal.
Right.
Our role today is strictly as impartial analytical guides. We're just unpacking the structural arguments, the military analyses, and the diplomatic innovations that are contained entirely within the author's text.
Exactly. We are just looking at the architecture of the author's thought experiment. Okay, let's unpack this, because the foundation of that thought experiment is the sheer physical reality of the battlefield in this Operation Epic Fury.
It's the grounding for everything else that happens.
Right. The author describes a scenario where the U.S. and Israel are executing these sustained, incredibly precise airstrikes against Iran. But despite this massive campaign, Iran's core military capability remains essentially intact. And to understand why this wild diplomatic miracle is required later in the text, you really have to understand the geology of what's happening on the ground.
You really do. Because the author identifies this fundamental shift in asymmetric warfare, and it's driven almost entirely by subterranean engineering.
Right, they're digging deep.
Very deep. Iran's missile complexes, they aren't just sitting out in the open on a tarmac where a satellite can see them. They're integrated directly into the Zagros Mountains.
Yeah, and we're not talking about a basement here.
No, we are talking about complexes buried under hundreds of meters of limestone and solid granite. To put that in perspective, a standard GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator.
Which is the U.S. military's premier bunker buster.
Exactly. That weapon can penetrate perhaps 60 feet of reinforced concrete, which is impressive.
Yeah.
But when the target is buried 300 feet under a mountain, conventional air superiority is basically nullified by sheer rock.
Wow. So it's not just that they're hiding, it's that they have built this impenetrable launch pad. And what they are launching is where this gets genuinely alarming for military planners.
Oh, absolutely.
The text emphasizes these waves of drones and hypersonic weapons. And, we hear the word hypersonic thrown around a lot in the news, but the actual mechanics of why that specifically creates a military impasse, that's crucial here.
Well, it really comes down to physics, right? Physics and flight paths. Because a traditional intercontinental ballistic missile, it flies in this very predictable parabola.
Right, like throwing a baseball.
Exactly like throwing a baseball. Radar systems can calculate the arc, figure out where it's going to land, and then launch interceptors to meet it at a specific point in the sky.
But a hypersonic weapon doesn't do that.
No. A hypersonic glide vehicle travels at Mach 5 or faster so over 3,800 miles per hour. But the crucial part is that it can maneuver mid-flight. within the atmosphere.
It's steer.
It's steering. It doesn't follow a predictable arc. So by the time traditional radar systems calculate its trajectory, it has already changed course.
Which just renders standard defense umbrellas like incredibly porous. I mean, they're practically useless against a swarm of these things.
They really are.
So Iran uses these subterranean fortresses not just to launch offensive strikes, but as this paralyzing deterrent.
Yeah.
Because if the U.S. or Israel tries to, say, put ground forces into those mountains to dig the missiles out manually.
The retaliation via these maneuverable, basically unstoppable weapons would be immediate. It would be devastating.
Right. And this brings up an analogy I was thinking about while reading this. It's like playing a really high-stakes game of chess on this beautiful high-tech board, but your opponent is simultaneously playing whack-a-mole in a fortified basement.
That's a great way to put it.
You just can't checkmate someone who physically isn't on the board.
You can't. And this is where the author introduces what I think is a really critical structural concept: the severe divergence between the military clock and the political clock.
Okay, break that down for us.
So the two sides are literally fighting on different timelines. Iran's strategy, according to the text, is not about achieving a conventional military victory. They aren't trying to march an army into an enemy capital.
Right.
Their strategy is simply regime survival. For the Islamic Republic in this scenario, endurance is victory. If they simply survive the bombardment down in those bunkers, their military clock ticks along just fine.
But the political clock in the United States is just ticking at warp speed. I mean, think about the design of a democratic republic versus an autocratic system.
Right.
The U.S. operates under this relentless 24-hour media cycle. Every single casualty, every multi-million-dollar drone that gets shot down, every spike in gas prices at the pump because an oil tanker was disrupted in the Gulf.
It all registers.
Viscerally and immediately with voters.
The feedback loop is instantaneous. The administration absorbs profound political damage every single day the conflict drags on without a clear resolution.
You've got congressional hearings, you've got tanking poll numbers, intense economic anxiety.
Exactly. And the author argues that a superpower simply cannot sustain an indefinite high-intensity holding pattern when the domestic political cost is compounding on a daily basis.
So the U.S. is basically trapped in this scenario. You can't win from the air because of the literal mountains. You can't win on the ground because of the hypersonic deterrent. And you can't just sit back and wait it out because your own domestic politics will just devour you.
Right. It's a true impasse.
And the text points out that this really leaves only two options: an unsustainable, multi-decade occupation that the American public would absolutely never accept,
Right.
or accepting a state of perpetual low-level conflict.
Neither of which looks anything like a victory. And this military impasse, it forces a deeply uncomfortable realization
Which is what?
that it's not just about one failed military campaign. It exposes a massive structural limitation of American power as a whole, and the text draws a direct historical parallel to a moment when another global power hit its own brick wall.
Oh, right. The 1958 Suez Crisis.
Yes, the ghost of Suez.
The Suez Crisis is one of those absolute textbook historical pivots. For those who might not remember, Britain and France, they were still kind of operating under the illusion of their old imperial mandates, right?
Very much so.
And they tried to seize the Suez Canal militarily. They basically assumed they could just project force and dictate terms the exact same way they had for centuries.
But they were entirely blind to the new global reality.
Yeah.
I mean, tactically, they successfully occupy the canal zone militarily.
Yeah.
But strategically, they were forced into this humiliating retreat by a massive, coordinated economic and political pressure campaign.
From the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
It's such a great historical analogy. Suez was basically a geopolitical margin call.
Yeah.
Britain and France thought they had this infinite strategic credit based on their history.
Right.
But Washington and Moscow, who were the actual new account holders of global power at that time, they called the margin. They threatened to dump the British pound, cut off the oil lifelines, and it instantly laid bare that European great power status was just a ghost.
That is exactly the mechanism of power shifting. And the author's chilling proposition here is that the U.S. in 2026 is facing its own Suez moment. Wow. By engaging in a highly visible conflict where its absolute military might cannot force a decisive political outcome, Washington risks exposing the outer limits of its unipolar dominance.
And it's not because they lack firepower.
Not at all. It's because the global architecture has shifted completely beneath its feet.
Which forces us to look at what exactly that architecture has shifted into. I mean, if the post-Suez world was bipolar run by the US and the Soviets, and the post-Cold War world was unipolar run entirely by the US, what is the operating system now?
Well, the author theorizes that the world has been functionally multipolar since the 2008 financial crisis.
Okay, so going back quite a bit.
Yeah, you have the economic ascent of China, obviously.
Yeah.
You have the resurgence of a much more aggressive Russia, the incredible demographic and economic rise of India.
Mhm.
And you have the assertiveness of these middle powers who just refuse to simply align with Washington or Beijing anymore. The sheer weight of global GDP and military capability is now widely distributed.
But here's the catch, right? The reality of global power is distributed, but our management tools for that power are completely centralized.
That is the core friction.
The author points out that our global institutions, we're talking the UN Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, they haven't been structurally updated in decades.
They are entirely obsolete for the current moment. What's fascinating here is that they were engineered for a completely different world, a post-1945 world.
Yeah.
Take the World Trade Organization, for example, which the text specifically highlights. The WTO was codified in the mid-1990s.
Right, the end of history era.
Exactly. That was a pre-digital era. It was built before the massive complexities of modern supply chain logistics. And critically, it assumed a world that was moving uniformly toward free market democratization.
Which didn't happen.
No. It has absolutely no mechanisms to handle state-sponsored capitalism or technological decoupling or, the weaponization of critical minerals.
It's like, are we basically trying to run the latest, highly complex 2026 global software on a 1995 operating system?
That is exactly what we're doing.
At what point does the entire system just crash? Because when a regional conflict like Operation Epic Fury breaks out, you can't just boot up the UN Security Council to solve it. The software is fundamentally incompatible with the hardware of a multipolar world.
Right. It blue screens. And when those overarching management institutions fail, every regional conflict threatens to spiral out of control because there are no universally agreed-upon rules of engagement or de-escalation anymore.
It's a free-for-all.
It is. And this obsolescence creates a massive diplomatic vacuum.
So if the old global operating system is crashing and the U.S. can't unilaterally force a military victory, who actually steps into that power vacuum to negotiate? Because the traditional avenues are totally deadlocked.
Completely did.
We're dealing with maximalist demands on both sides. The U.S. and Israel demand the complete, verifiable dismantling of Iran's missile and nuclear programs.
Right.
Meanwhile, Iran insists on absolute regime survival and the total lifting of all Western economic sanctions.
The Venn diagram of those two sets of demands consists of two completely separate circles. They do not touch.
Not at all.
And normally, historically, this is exactly the scenario where a superpower leans on its vast network of allies to exert secondary pressure. But the author's analysis of the current Western alliance structure is incredibly stark.
Yeah, let's talk about the traditional allies for a second.
Yeah.
Why can't European powers step in and project the necessary hard power to force a resolution here?
It's really a matter of sheer logistical capacity. European militaries are described in the text as simply too small. They're highly constrained by domestic pacifist politics,
Right.
and they severely lack strategic lift capability. To sustain a credible military threat in the Persian Gulf, you need massive air refueling fleets. You need heavy cargo transport like C-17s. You need integrated naval logistics.
Which Europe doesn't have at scale.
Right. European nations rely almost entirely on the U.S. military spine for that kind of power projection. So they can issue strongly worded condemnations all day long, but they cannot alter the actual math on the ground.
Okay, so Europe is out. What about the wealthy Gulf Arab partners right next door? I mean, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they have incredibly advanced Western-supplied militaries.
Very advanced.
And they view Iranian missiles as a literal existential threat. So why aren't they leading a coalition to solve this?
Because their risk tolerance is fundamentally different. The author points out that they prefer to hedge.
Hedge how?
Well, think about what they have built. They possess this gleaming, ultra-modernized infrastructure. We're talking glass cities like Dubai and Doha,
Right.
highly concentrated desalination plants, massive complex oil processing facilities. That infrastructure is incredibly fragile.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
A single volley of Iranian hypersonic missiles could literally set their economies back decades. So they're immensely wealthy, yes, but they are terrified of direct kinetic confrontation.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I mean, when traditional allies are financially rich but militarily hesitant, who actually steps up to broker peace? Because the U.S. is completely isolated in carrying the hard power burden here.
Exactly.
Now, reading this, I was really struck by the mention of a rumored back-channel compromise. There's this idea floating around in the text that the U.S. and Israel could just halt offensive operations, and in exchange, Iran reopens the Strait of Hormuz to oil tankers.
Right, the quick fix.
Yeah. On paper, that sounds like a rational, face-saving exit strategy for everyone. Why doesn't that solve the problem?
Because it merely pauses the military clock without resetting the geopolitical board.
Ah.
The author argues that such a deal is fundamentally unenforceable in the long term. But more importantly, it leaves Iran's core capabilities completely intact.
Right, the mountain bunkers are still there.
Exactly. Iran would simply utilize that pause to reconstitute its subterranean arsenal. They could potentially scale up their drone production, accelerate their uranium enrichment, all while the West looks away and sighs with relief.
So it just guarantees that the next round of hostilities will be substantially more violent.
Precisely. It's a temporary illusion of peace.
And we really need to pause and look at the macroeconomics of the Strait of Hormuz here, because that is the physical choke point driving all this global anxiety that the author highlights. We aren't just talking about a few cargo ships getting delayed.
No, not at all. The Strait of Hormuz is the ultimate geopolitical jugular.
The jugular.
Roughly 20 to 30% of the world's total oil consumption passes through that one narrow waterway. So when missiles are actively flying over it, marine insurance premiums for those very large crude carriers, they skyrocket.
Right, to completely commercially unviable levels.
Yes, shipping companies simply halt transits. They will not risk a $100 million vessel and its crew.
And the cascading effects of that are just brutal. I mean, oil supply drops, energy prices spike globally, manufacturing costs surge everywhere. And suddenly, you have this rampant supply-side inflation hitting every single consumer in the West. It's basically an economic gun pointed directly at the head of the global economy.
Which perfectly illustrates the author's core thesis here. The U.S. cannot endure this economically or politically, but they also cannot win it militarily.
Right.
The traditional allies are sidelined, the UN is paralyzed, and back-channel pauses offer no real security. So a completely new diplomatic architecture is desperately needed to bridge this gap.
Okay, so if Europe lacks the logistics and the Gulf lacks the risk tolerance, you are staring at a gaping vacuum in global mediation. And as we know, geopolitics absolutely despises a vacuum.
Yeah, we'll fill it with something.
Exactly. And the author suggests that a highly controversial rising alternative is the only entity capable of filling it. Enter the expanded BRICS coalition.
Now, this is where the text makes its most radical pivot. We have to look at the BRICS expansion that occurred back in 2024. For a long time, BRICS, which originally was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, it was viewed by a lot of Western analysts as little more than an acronym for an annual photo op.
Just a talking shop.
Exactly. But the addition of 6 new members fundamentally altered its geopolitical mass.
Yeah, let's look at that list. The text lists the new additions as Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates.
Right.
Now, just looking at that list, the contradictions are basically blinding. You have Iran sitting in the exact same economic bloc as Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Yeah.
Nations that are actively fighting proxy wars against Iranian influence. How can a coalition with that level of internal hostility possibly function as a unified peacemaker?
It's a brilliant question, and the author actually tackles it head-on. Because BRICS is not a cohesive alliance like NATO. NATO demands shared defensive values. BRICS is more of a syndicate of shared interests.
Okay.
The text highlights these fractured responses within the bloc itself. You have Russia and China publicly denouncing the U.S. and Israeli strikes. But then India, meanwhile, is criticizing the Iranian retaliation. Because New Delhi is deeply concerned about the safety of its own commercial shipping in the Gulf. There is no unified ideological voice here.
But the author argues that this internal friction is actually the secret to their leverage, right? Because they aren't a unified Western bloc trying to impose a solution, they actually possess the economic and diplomatic tethers to force everyone to the table.
Exactly. Consider the sheer leverage of what the text calls the BRICS core. Russia and China are not neutral observers in this conflict. They are the primary purchasers of sanctioned Iranian oil.
Right.
And they are the primary suppliers of advanced military and aerospace technology to Tehran. They literally hold the economic keys to Iran's survival. So if Beijing and Moscow demand that Iran sit at a table, Tehran really cannot refuse.
They just don't have a choice. And then you have India, right, who's practicing what looks like the ultimate multi-vector diplomacy.
Yes.
New Delhi has a highly advanced defense partnership with Israel, but they also have massive energy dependencies on Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Right.
And they have historical logistical ties to Iran, like the whole Chabahar port project. India can genuinely pick up the phone and speak to every single belligerent in this conflict without being viewed as an imperial surrogate.
And this is what the author means by shifting from Western imposition to a multipolar bargaining table.
Right.
The reason past UN or US-led initiatives fail is the perception, fair or not, that Washington is simply dictating terms to the vanquished. A BRICS-mediated process reflects the actual messy distribution of global power in 2026. It forces all those competing economic and security interests into a single room.
Honestly, this sounds like trying to resolve a massive family feud by inviting the entire deeply dysfunctional extended family to Thanksgiving dinner.
That's remarkably accurate.
But maybe that's the only way to get everyone to actually agree on the menu. Because you can't ignore anybody.
Right. Everyone has a veto over the mashed potatoes, so you have to compromise.
Exactly. Okay, so we've identified the players. We understand why this chaotic multipolar syndicate has the requisite leverage. Now we have to look at the mechanics of the deal itself.
The actual proposal.
Right. What are they actually negotiating? The author lays out a highly specific 5-point peace proposal. And what's fascinating to me is how interlocking these points are. You can't achieve point 5 without point 3.
They are completely codependent.
So let's walk the listener through the architecture of this proposed treaty.
Okay, the first point is the necessary baseline. An immediate, verifiable ceasefire and a full de-escalation of hostilities. All parties must halt kinetic strikes, drone deployments, and proxy militia operations simultaneously.
Right, you have to stop the bleeding so the patient can actually be operated on.
Exactly. And that leads directly to point 2, which addresses the global economic panic we discussed regarding the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, the jugular.
Point 2 demands the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to unrestricted commercial shipping. But it removes the issue of trust entirely. The text proposes that this reopening be backed by continuous international and BRICS monitoring naval task forces.
Oh, wow.
Yes, to ensure safe passage and aggressively deter any future closures or harassment of tankers.
So it's not just a promise on a piece of paper. It's physical, multinational eyes on the water.
Exactly.
Okay, now point 3. This tackles the absolute core of the Israeli and American anxiety, the nuclear file.
Right. Point 3 requires Iran to agree to a permanent IAEA-verified end to its nuclear weapons program. But here's the mechanism that makes this a uniquely multipolar solution. In return for halting high-level enrichment, Russia, acting as a BRICS partner with advanced civilian nuclear infrastructure, agrees to supply the low-enriched fuel required for Iran's civilian power reactors.
Okay, I have to say, this is a phenomenal mechanical solution to a diplomatic lie. Let's break down why for the listener.
Please do.
Because for decades, Iran has maintained that its vast arrays of centrifuges are purely for civilian energy production. We just want nuclear power.
Right, that's the official line.
But to generate electricity, uranium only needs to be enriched to about 3 to 5% of the U-235 isotope. To build a weapon, you need to enrich it to 90%.
Precisely. If Iran simply wants to keep the lights on in Tehran, they do not need massive subterranean cascades of advanced IR-6 centrifuges.
Right.
By having Russia step in and guarantee the delivery of that 5% civilian fuel, the author argues that BRICS completely strips away Iran's energy-only alibi.
Oh, that's smart.
It is. If Tehran rejects the Russian fuel and insists on domestic high-level enrichment, they are broadcasting to their own allies in Beijing and Moscow that their actual goal is a nuclear warhead. It boxes them in geopolitically.
It's an incredibly elegant trap. Okay, then we get to point 4, which addresses the physical weapons causing the current military impasse we talked about earlier.
The missiles.
Right. Tehran must accept verifiable curbs on its ballistic and hypersonic missile programs. So we're talking about strict limits on payload capacities, flight ranges, and deployment locations. But the verification mechanism the author proposes is entirely novel.
Because the author notes that Iran would never, ever allow American or European inspectors into their subterranean mountain bases.
Never.
Therefore, the verification, which would utilize both satellite telemetry and on-site physical inspections, would be conducted by a technical group endorsed by BRICS.
Okay, I have to interject here because the friction this would cause in Washington would be absolutely atomic.
Oh,
I mean,
undoubtedly.
I understand the logic, but can you imagine the level of trust required for the U.S. Pentagon and the IDF to rely on a BRICS technical team, a team that potentially includes Russian, Chinese, or Brazilian scientists, to verify that Iran isn't quietly assembling hypersonic glide vehicles under a mountain?
It's a huge leap of faith.
The level of trust required there is almost unfathomable to me.
It is arguably the weakest link in the chain, and the author does not shy away from that reality at all. Verifying subterranean engineering is notoriously difficult under the best of circumstances.
Right, you're looking for what, seismic data?
Seismic signatures, swab testing for exotic solid propellants. It is technically grueling work. But the text argues you have to weigh that profound discomfort against the alternative.
That is endless war.
Exactly. And in exchange for swallowing this bitter pill of BRICS verification, the U.S. and Israel are required to issue formal, binding security assurances,
Meaning what?
a cessation of all future military attacks, and a codified end to covert regime change operations.
Okay. And finally, point 5. The economic carrot that brings Iran to the table to accept all of this in the first place.
Right. A phased lifting of all unilateral U.S. economic sanctions, but strictly tied to compliance milestones verified in points 3 and 4. This would finally allow Iran to reintegrate into the global financial system.
But again, there's a multipolar twist here.
There is. The text highlights a workaround, potentially utilizing BRICS payment mechanisms to ease the transition.
And let's explain that, because I think a lot of people assume lifting sanctions just means someone in the Treasury Department in Washington flips a switch and dollars start flowing again.
That's not how it works.
No. The global financial system is currently dominated by SWIFT, which is a messaging network heavily influenced by U.S. jurisdiction. But the author suggests that BRICS is developing its own de-dollarized financial architecture.
Right, things like cross-border central bank digital currencies or the Enbridge project.
Exactly, which basically allows nations to clear payments without ever touching a U.S. correspondent bank.
It creates an entirely alternative financial plumbing system. Now, the author acknowledges this entire 5-point package is extraordinarily fragile.
Oh, a stiff breeze could knock it over.
Seriously, hardliners in the West would decry it as a capitulation to a post-American world order. Iranian hardliners would claim they survived the Western onslaught and demand even more concessions.
Right.
But the text insists that this meticulously balanced framework represents the only viable path to negotiated coexistence.
But, and here is the ultimate bottleneck in all of geopolitics. You can have the most brilliant, perfectly balanced 5-point plan sitting on a desk. But it is completely useless if the parties refuse to actually sit down and sign it.
That is the hurdle.
And the author makes a very compelling case that traditional statecraft, the actual way we conduct these negotiations, is fundamentally broken. To force these bitter enemies to agree, the author proposes a radical change in the psychology of diplomacy itself.
The text argues that we must entirely abandon the traditional model of closed-door summits in Geneva or Vienna. And the author introduces a concept they call C-SPAN diplomacy.
Okay, reading this part, I was genuinely shocked.
It's wild.
The proposal is to hold an open, fully televised, completely unfiltered roundtable, 8 chairs, the United States, Israel, Iran, and the 5 founding BRICS nations.
Right.
No side rooms where the real deals are cut, no observers whispering in the wings. Every delegation has an equal microphone, and the entire proceeding is broadcast live on international networks, complete with simultaneous translation and real-time subtitles.
It is a complete inversion of traditional diplomatic theory.
And it feels completely counterintuitive. I mean, here's where it gets really interesting, because we live in an era dominated by viral clips, deep fakes, and performative politics.
Right.
My immediate thought was that putting this on live television would just turn it into a massive grandstanding circus. Doesn't putting this on live television risk turning it into a massive performance where politicians just play to their bases rather than actually compromising? Don't they need secrecy to make painful compromises without being immediately crucified?
That is the conventional wisdom, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the author's psychological analysis of modern transparencies suggests the exact opposite.
Oh, so?
The text argues that closed-door diplomacy actually breeds maximalist posturing.
Right.
It allows a foreign minister to walk into a sealed room, make impossible, completely unreasonable demands.
Right.
And when the talks inevitably collapse, they just walk out to the press pool and blame the other side.
Yeah.
Secrecy gives them the political cover to be stubborn.
Ah, because the public never sees the actual give and take, they just hear the spin afterward.
It's exactly. Televised diplomacy strips away that cover entirely. It forces leaders to articulate and defend their red lines, not just to their geopolitical enemies, but to their own citizens and to the global market in real time.
Wow.
The author writes that this radically raises the reputational cost of intransigence.
So if an Iranian diplomat rejects a perfectly reasonable proposal for civilian nuclear fuel, or an American diplomat refuses a verifiable missile curb, they have to do it on camera. They have to go home and explain to a public suffering from inflation, sanctions, and fear of war why they chose to walk away from peace.
Precisely. And the text points to historical precedents to back this up. The author references the 1978 Camp David Accords.
Okay, but those were secret, weren't they?
While the negotiations themselves were secluded, the framework's success relied heavily on the intense public framing of the stakes by the leaders involved. It forced them to commit publicly to the process. The text also likens this to modern parliamentary debates. Yes, the first hour might be performative grandstanding for the cameras, but the author argues that sustained, unblinking public exposure eventually compels seriousness. In a hyper-connected 247 media age, secrecy no longer equals leverage. It just breeds suspicion.
The visual of this is just incredible to imagine. Picture it. 8 microphones, the intense heat of live cameras, the global financial markets watching every single glance, every beat of sweat, every counteroffer.
It's intense.
For the US and Israel, it's a terrifying vulnerability, but also a chance to demonstrate to the global South that they want verifiable security, not imperial conquest.
Right.
For Iran, it's the ultimate global stage to argue for economic relief, but they have to do it while staring down the barrel of IAEA inspection limits on live TV.
It is a diplomatic high-wire act. And the author absolutely recognizes that to prevent this from devolving into an endless reality television show, you have to implement severe forcing functions.
You need rules.
You need the right venue, the right personnel, and an absolute unforgiving clock.
Okay, let's look at those forcing functions. The author proposes that this summit takes place in Delhi, India. Now, why Delhi? Why not Geneva or New York or even Beijing?
Because venue dictates perception. If we look at the geopolitical map of 2026, India is the ultimate neutral ground for a multipolar crisis.
Right.
As we discussed earlier, India is a founding BRICS member, yet it maintains strong defense ties with Israel and deep energy relations with the Gulf. It has historical diplomatic channels to Tehran, Moscow, and Washington.
So hosting it in Delhi physically removes the proceedings from the legacy of Western dominance that you'd feel in Geneva.
Exactly.
But it also avoids the perception of Chinese hegemony that you'd get if you hosted it in Beijing. It places the summit squarely in the geopolitical center of gravity, the global South.
Right. And the text specifies exactly who must sit in those 8 chairs. It cannot be the presidents, the prime ministers, or the supreme leaders.
Oh, interesting. Who is it then?
It must be the foreign ministers.
That seems like an odd choice for an issue of this magnitude. I mean, if you want a historic deal, don't you need the ultimate decision makers in the room?
The author argues that deploying heads of state actually creates paralysis. A president or a prime minister cannot afford to be seen publicly negotiating or retreating from a stated position. It's too politically damaging.
Right, they have to look strong at all times.
Exactly. Foreign ministers, however, carry plenipotentiary authority. They are high enough in the chain of command to signal absolute seriousness to the world. But they possess just enough political distance from the head of state to maintain tactical flexibility.
Ah, so they can take the heat.
Yes, they can negotiate, consult their capitals instantly via secure lines while the cameras are rolling, and sign frameworks without the ultimate binding finality of a presidential signature. This gives the leaders back home the necessary political buffer to sell the deal to their populations.
Fascinating. And then we get to the final and honestly most brutal forcing function, the clock.
The clock is everything.
The author imposes a hard 72-hour time limit on the Delhi summit. 3 days to untangle one of the most complex, multi-layered geopolitical crises of the 21st century.
It is a brutally compressed timeline, and the author maps it out sequentially. Day 1 is entirely dedicated to the immediate mechanics of survival, finalizing the ceasefire and establishing the naval monitoring protocols to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay.
Day 2 tackles the most technically fraught issues, the Russian civilian nuclear fuel swap and the BRICS verification of missile curbs.
Heavy lifting.
Exactly. And Day 3 focuses on the economic and diplomatic payoff, The phased sanctions relief and the codified security assurances?
It's the ultimate diplomatic escape room. I mean, you have 72 hours, the entire global economy is watching, and if you fail, you have to look into the camera and own the failure.
The author compares this to historical deadlines. The text references the 13 days of the Camp David Accords and the 21 days it took to forge the Dayton Agreement ending the Bosnian War.
So 3 days is insanely fast.
Exponentially tighter. But the author argues that the speed of the modern information environment demands it. If you let a televised summit drag on for 3 weeks, you invite endless sabotage from external actors, deep fakes, and domestic political uprisings.
You have to strike while the iron is hot.
You have to limit the time frame to force immediate pragmatic concessions.
So what happens at midnight on day 3 if they're still deadlocked?
If the clock runs out without a signed framework, the text dictates that the 8 foreign ministers must publicly explain why on live television.
Oh, man.
The world gets to see exactly who blocked progress. The author's thesis is that rejecting a balanced, multipolar package in front of billions of viewers carries a catastrophic domestic and international cost. It is a cost far more damaging than a quiet stalemate in a closed room in Switzerland.
The structural elegance of this thought experiment is genuinely staggering. We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
I mean, we started deep inside the subterranean granite complexes of Iran, exploring a military impasse where overwhelming high-tech U.S. air power is essentially neutralized by the geographic reality of asymmetric warfare and hypersonic deterrence.
Right. And from there, we examined how that specific military failure exposes the obsolescence of our entire post-WWII global architecture.
The 1995 software problem.
Exactly. We looked at how institutions built for a unipolar world are crashing under the weight of a state-capitalist multipolar reality, forcing a geopolitical reckoning akin to the 1958 Suez Crisis.
Then we unpacked the massive diplomatic vacuum this creates and how the expanded BRICS coalition, despite all of its internal chaotic contradictions, is uniquely positioned to fill it.
Because they possess the exact economic and diplomatic leverage that traditional Western allies lack.
Exactly. And finally, we dissected the mechanics of the author's 5-point proposal, culminating in the radically transparent mechanism to achieve it. An open, live televised 72-hour summit in Delhi, where the old rules of secret statecraft are basically burned away by the unforgiving glare of a global audience.
That's a fascinating vision.
It is a breathtakingly detailed roadmap for rewriting the rules of global diplomacy. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to turn it back to you for one final thought.
Okay.
The author builds this entire framework on the premise that transparency is the ultimate forcing function, that seeing the truth live on television compels leaders to act rationally.
It's a powerful premise. But, it raises a deeply unsettling question for us to mull over.
Yeah.
If C-SPAN diplomacy is indeed the future of conflict resolution, what happens when open-source peacemaking collides with the era of advanced deepfakes and AI-driven misinformation?
Oh, wow. Think about it. If the whole world is watching live, and a malicious state actor injects a synthetic audio clip or a perfectly manipulated video feed into the broadcast, showing a diplomat saying something absolutely unforgivable,
Right.
how do we ensure the audience is actually seeing the truth?
That is an epistemic nightmare. I mean, when the barrier to creating a viral, hyper-realistic lie is basically zero, does radical transparency actually solve the diplomatic impasse? Or does it just create an entirely new, incredibly vulnerable attack surface for bad actors to exploit?
It is arguably the defining question for the future of truth in a multipolar age.
A massive, terrifying concept to leave you with. Thank you so much for joining us at the table for this intensely detailed deep dive into the limits of modern power and the hypothetical future of global peacemaking. The old geopolitical playbook is actively burning, and the new rules of the world are being rewritten right in front of us. Keep questioning, keep exploring the mechanics behind the headlines, and we'll see you next time.